This is a video about the nature of the Bodhisattva in Buddhism, about what a Bodhisattva is, and most importantly, what the differences are between what Mahayana and Theravada Buddhists think about Bodhisattvas. So let's start with a quick definition. What is a Bodhisattva? So a Bodhisattva is any person on the path to becoming a Buddha. Anyone who's making that journey towards becoming a Buddha. You might think, well, aren't all Buddhists on that journey? Well, as we'll see, it's a bit more complicated than that. This is going to be a slightly longer video than some of my videos because it's a complicated issue, and it's going to have three sections. We're going to start by looking at what Theravada Buddhists think about Bodhisattvas. Then we'll look at Mahayana views. The last two sections will be shorter. We'll look at what an advanced Bodhisattva is, because that's quite important. And we'll look at this, lastly, a controversial issue. Do Bodhisattvas delay their enlightenment? That'll all become clear what that means later. Let's start with Theravada Buddhism. So what is Theravada, first of all? Theravada is the only form of Buddhism found today which does not accept the authenticity of the Mahayana scriptures or the Mahayana sutras, and therefore only believe in the Tripitaka, the three baskets, as the word of the Buddha. Now, the Tripitaka, or three baskets, are the scriptures that come from the original Buddha. Now, whether those teachings actually literally come from the original Buddha, we don't know. But what we do know is that those scriptures emerged earlier than the Mahayana scriptures, and they are the scriptures that claim to be the words of the historical Buddha. Now, the Tripitaka, the three baskets, exists in many different versions. So many different, slightly different versions were maintained in ancient India, because there were lots of different forms of Buddhism in ancient India. The version of the Tripitaka that the Theravada follow is called the Pali Canon. That is because it's written in the Pali language, which is one of the languages of ancient India. So Theravada Buddhists are Buddhists who follow the Pali Canon only. They don't follow the Pali, the Mahayana scriptures. Some people call Theravada Buddhism the original or oldest form of Buddhism. It's more complicated than that, because actually before Mahayana Buddhism started, there were actually lots of kinds of early Buddhism, all of them following slightly different versions of this Tripitaka. What Theravada is the only form of Buddhism that does not accept the Mahayana scriptures to still exist today. So that is the sense in which people call it the oldest form of Buddhism. In the Pali language, the word bodhisattva is a Sanskrit word, and Sanskrit and Pali are two closely related ancient Indian languages. But in Pali, the word is written like this, bodhisattva. So that V sound is not there. There's no V. Bodhisattva. Now, in the Pali Canon, the word is used mostly to refer to Siddhartha Gautama before he reached enlightenment. That is Siddhartha, the historical Buddha, the Buddha whose story you most often hear of, the Buddha who was born in the palace and then saw the four sights, and then left the palace and then tried to starve himself and then reached enlightenment and so on. In his journey towards enlightenment, he is often referred to as the Bodhisattva, because that is the being who is working towards becoming a Buddha. More on the Theravada view. The term Bodhisattva is also used to refer to Siddhartha in his previous lives. Obviously, Buddhism believes in a rebirth, and some of the previous lives, or lots of the previous lives of Siddhartha, are recorded in the Pali Canon. They are in what are called the Jatakas. The Jataka tales, or Jataka stories, are the stories of the Buddha's previous lives before he became Siddhartha, before he became the Buddha. 547 Jataka stories are included in the Pali Canon. It's a lot of stories. In some of these, the Bodhisattva is a human, so sometimes he's a human in that rebirth, or sometimes in others he is reborn as different kinds of animals. So sometimes these are stories about animals doing things. Now, what happens is these stories begin with the first story, in which the Bodhisattva, that is Siddhartha in his previous lives, is born as a man called Sumedha, and he meets a previous Buddha, and that Buddha is called Dipankara. So Sumedha meets Dipankara. When he meets Dipankara, he decides he also wants to become a Buddha. And he spends the rest of his rebirths, until he's born as Siddhartha, practicing what are called the perfections. These are 10 qualities such as generosity, morality, patience, and loving kindness that must be perfected if someone wants to become a Buddha. So if you want to become a Buddha, you've got to go through all these different lives, practicing different qualities. So each of the Jataka stories shows him practicing some great quality, either being really patient, being really kind, being really generous, and so on and so on. Each story, and the idea is that gradually he's becoming more and more perfect until he has perfected them enough that he can become a Buddha in his final rebirth. Now, from what you know of Buddhism already, what's been said so far should give rise to some questions. For example, the Pali Canon records that hundreds of people reached enlightenment by following the teachings of the Buddha, of Siddhartha. If that's the case, if when you meet a Buddha you can just follow that Buddha then, in that life, and get enlightened, why did Sumedha, in the Siddhartha in his previous life, not just become a follower of Dipankara and reach enlightenment straight away? Why didn't he just, if enlightenment's so good, why didn't Sumedha just get enlightened by following that Buddha? Instead, he met this Buddha, but he didn't become his follower. He just made a vow that in a future life he will become a Buddha. Now, here's where it gets complicated. If Sumedha had followed Dipankara and got enlightenment then, he would have become what's called an arahant. An arahant is someone who reaches enlightenment by following the teachings that have already been revealed by a Buddha. Instead, he wanted to be a Buddha. A Buddha is someone who rediscovers the Dharma when it has been lost from the world. The next slide will go into that in more detail. So according to Buddhism, the truths of Buddhism, the Dharma, always exist, but over time they disappear and need to be rediscovered again. A Buddha is the name we give to a person who rediscovers the Dharma at a time when it's become lost. Buddhas are rare because a new Buddha can only come about when the teachings of the previous Buddha have completely disappeared from the world. So this is how it works. There's a Buddha. Then his teachings last a certain amount of time, but as all things are impermanent, eventually his teachings will disappear from the world and the truths of Buddhism, the Dharma, will not be known. Then another Buddha comes about. He reveals the truths. Then the truths decline and they disappear. Then there's another Buddha. Then his truths decline and disappear. So it's not like the Buddha teachings are ever changing. It's just that over time they disappear and they get lost. And then a new Buddha comes about. And that is, according to Theravada Buddhism, what happens again and again and again and again. So at the moment there can't be a Buddha because the teachings of Siddhartha still exist in the world. We're 2,000 years or 2,500 years after the Buddha lived or died, and his teachings still exist. But according to Buddhism, one day his teachings will disappear from the world, no one will know about them again, and then a new Buddha would come about. So as you can see, Buddhas are very rare because there can only be one Buddha at a time, and in fact there can only be one Buddha, and then that Buddha will die, and then you've got to wait until his teachings have disappeared completely, and then another Buddha can come about. So here's the question: should people become Buddhas? Should they do what Sumedha did, or should they become arahants? What's a better thing to do? In Theravada Buddhism, the normal goal for Theravada Buddhists is to become an arahant. This is for the following reasons. Number one, becoming a Buddha takes far longer because you must wait until the Dharma of the previous Buddha has disappeared, so it would take a long time. Secondly, arahants are equal to Buddhas in terms of their attainments. They have reached the end of suffering, realised the truth of anatta, no self, and will not be reborn again in samsara. So all the things that you're trying to get to as a Buddhist, they have realised, arahants. So there's no real reason for you to have to become a Buddha. Thirdly, the Buddha taught his followers to follow the Eightfold Path, which leads to becoming an arahant. So he clearly saw this as the path that most people should follow. The Bodhisattva path leading to becoming a Buddha is seen as a path only for rare, heroic individuals. So that's the situation in Theravada Buddhism. You know, there's this rare, like 1 in a billion or something person who will go through the path to become a Buddha and rediscover the Dharma. But most people should become an arahant. Now, there's a but here. Because Rupert Gethin, who's a great scholar of Buddhism, and his book Foundations of Buddhism is probably the best introduction to Buddhist thought. Rupert Gethin says in that book, he points out that he wants to say that even though that Mahayana the Theravada idea about bodhisattvas is different to the Mahayana. He wants to say there is some slight similarities. So he argues that even though Theravada in many ways sees Buddhas and Arahants as equal, there are, there's a typo there, sorry, some ways in which a Buddha is seen as superior. And here are the two. Firstly, the path is longer and more arduous. Arduous just means it's hard work. So if you look at Sumedha, he went through 547 births to become a Buddha, building up these qualities over all that time. So it's a tougher path. Secondly, the path is seen as showing greater compassion because you are not only reaching enlightenment, but opening up the possibility of enlightenment in a world in which the teachings have disappeared. So in those two ways, there is something special about being a bodhisattva or bodhisattva. There's something great about it because the bodhisattva is the person who goes to the harder path, and they're the person who opens up Buddhism to people who without him, it wouldn't be possible to practice Buddhism. So there's Theravada. We're going to move on to Mahayana in a moment. And the teachings they have about the Mahayana is the main difference between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. Sorry, the teachings about the Bodhisattva. So Mahayana views. Let's just do a little bit about what Mahayana Buddhism is. So Mahayana Buddhists are those that accept the authenticity of new Buddhist scriptures that began to emerge from the 1st century BC onwards. So if the Buddha lived like 500 BCE, we're not really sure exactly when he lived, but 500, 600, round about then. These scriptures obviously are beginning to emerge a long time after the Buddha lived, and these are known as the Mahayana Sutras, but they accept them as the authentic teachings of the Buddha. They see these scriptures as in fact the highest and truest teachings of the Buddha and believe that they had been lost or hidden at the time of the Buddha before emerging later. So there are various explanations of where these scriptures were for all this time. But according to Mahayana, however they explain the fact that they took so long to emerge or to be known, they think that these are actually the Buddha's highest or truest teachings. Now, these Mahayana Buddhists accept the Tripitaka. Remember, the Tripitaka is the word given, it means 3 baskets. It's the name given to the early Buddhist scriptures. In the Theravada tradition, they call them the Pali Canon, but in Buddhism in generally they call them the Tripitaka. So those teachings are accepted by Mahayana Buddhists, but they do not see it as containing the Buddhist highest teachings. So they would say the Tripitaka or the Pali Canon doesn't contain the Buddhist highest teachings. And in situations, and there are situations, when the Mahayana Sutras differ from the Tripitaka, they will accept the truth of the Mahayana Sutras. They'll say, this is the Buddha's final word. This is his most important teachings. So that's what a Mahayana Buddhist is, someone who accepts the truth of the Mahayana scripture. What does the name Mahayana mean? Mahayana means great way. Yana means way, or can mean vehicle. Maha means great. So the great way or the great vehicle. The name reflects the claim that Mahayana teachings and path of Mahayana Buddhism are superior to those of non-Mahayana Buddhism. The Mahayana Sutras refer to non-Mahayana Buddhism as the Hinayana. There's a bit of a mistake there. So they refer to non-Mahayana Buddhism as the Hinayana, it should say. This means small or narrow way or small or narrow vehicle. And this is an insulting term. My typing errors all over the place here. Sorry, guys. This is an insulting term, and non-Mahayana Buddhists never accepted this label. So Theravada Buddhists don't think of themselves as Hinayana because that's an insult. The only form of non-Mahayana Buddhism existing today is Theravada Buddhism, but when Mahayana Buddhism first emerged, there were many other non-Mahayana forms of Buddhism. So yeah, that's what's often confusing, is that at the time when Mahayana came out and they talked about Hinayana Buddhism, they meant all these different kinds of Buddhism, but all of them were the same because they didn't accept the Mahayana teachings. Today, the only form of Buddhism that fits into that label would be Theravada, but Theravada wouldn't accept the label Hinayana because it's obviously an insult. It's kind of saying that their way is the small way, the lesser way, the not so good way, whereas Mahayana is a great way. So what's this got to do with bodhisattvas? There are many Mahayana sutras, and they contain many teachings. So you can't say, like, this is the one thing that Mahayana sutras are about. There's many Mahayana sutras, and they talk about lots of different things. There are lots of different things that came out in the Mahayana. However, the defining teaching of Mahayana Buddhism, by which I mean the thing that makes a Mahayana Buddhist a Mahayana Buddhist, is that the Bodhisattva path, the idea that the Bodhisattva path should be the goal of all Buddhists and not just a tiny minority. So from it being that in Theravada or non-Mahayana, early Buddhism, you get this idea that the Bodhisattva path to becoming a Buddha is for a few individuals, only a small number of individuals, and most Buddhists should just try to become an arahant. Within Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva path is seen as the most compassionate path, as it is about guiding others to nirvana. The arahant path, by contrast, is seen as selfish, as you are only seeking enlightenment for yourself. Now, obviously, this raises some problems, and we're going to look at the problems now. Problem 1. How do they deal, this is how do Mahayana Buddhists deal with the fact that the Buddha taught most people to follow the arahant path? Now, that's a good question, because in the Tripitaka, or the Pali Canon, the early scriptures, the Buddha says to most people, follow the Eightfold Path, become an arahant. So this is how they explain it. The Mahayana Sutras argue that when he taught people to follow the path to becoming an arahant, the Buddha was using what's called skillful means. That's a key term in Buddhism, skillful means. This is the idea that Buddhas will sometimes lie or withhold the truth when it brings about a good result. In Mahayana Sutras such as the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha reveals that he originally taught people the selfish arahant path, as he knew that people would find the Bodhisattva path too challenging. By teaching people the easier path, he gave them motivation to begin to practice Buddhism. Once people have started practicing and made some progress, the Buddha can then reveal that their true goal is to become a Buddha. Terrible typing errors. I put the wrong kind of there on this video. Oh well, never mind. So this is the idea, is that yes, in the early Buddhist teachings, he told people to become an arahant, but what Mahayana scriptures are saying is that basically, if you told people you need to become a Buddha and get enlightened for the sake of all other people, that would have been off-putting to people, because one, people are quite selfish, and so they want to reach enlightenment for themselves. Secondly, it's easier to become an arahant than a Buddha, so people would think, oh God, I can't do that, I can't go on the Bodhisattva path and become a Buddha, but I can try and become an arahant. So therefore, he says to them, this is your goal, you should try and become an arahant, but really, he only says that to get them started. And then once they've started on the Buddhist path of meditation and following all the things in the Eightfold Path, once they've got to a certain stage in it, he will be able to reveal to them that the true goal should be to become a Buddha, and they will be able to accept that because now they're a certain way along the path and it doesn't seem so daunting to them to follow the Bodhisattva path. So the Lotus Sutra teaches this in the form of some parables. He tries to explain it in forms of some parables. The most famous one is the burning house. I'll just go through this parable. Here is the parable. An old wise man returns from his travels to his large and crumbling mansion to find it is on fire, and his many sons are trapped inside. He tells them the situation and calls them to come out, but they do not understand what the statement, "the house is on fire," means, and they are absorbed with their playthings. So the father tells them that he has presents outside, goat carts for some, deer carts for others, and bullock carts for the rest. The children then hurry to come out and ask for the carts, but the father does not have them. Instead, he gives each child an enormous and magnificent cart of a type far beyond any splendour they could have imagined, drawn by a white oxen. In modern terms, it is as if the children had expected to receive push bikes, motorbikes, and automobiles, and each was presented with a starship. They forget their former expectations and joyfully ride on the marvellous ox carts. So, here's what he does. They won't come out because they're ignorant. They're in a house on fire and they won't come out. The analogy here is to say that's like people who are suffering. People don't really understand that they're suffering. It's very difficult to communicate them because they're so kind of lost in their world of suffering, and they're so absorbed by the kind of petty things of their lives. Absorbed with their playthings. We're too busy having this very small and petty enjoyment we have in life to really respond to Buddhism. If the Buddha was to suggest to us to become bodhisattvas straight away, go on the bodhisattva path, it would be too amazing to us. We would just think it was beyond us. Probably we wouldn't. Perhaps in the analogy, if he'd said that there's an amazing cart drawn by a white oxen, they'd all just not believed him, or thought that was just out of their reach. So instead, he tells them something that he thinks will get them motivated. They think, oh, goat carts, deer carts, bullock carts. Those were the sort of things that would be exciting back in those days. So they run out to find them. Once they've run out, he then announces, no, that wasn't why I brought you out here. I brought you out to give you this even better cart. And they're like, wow, that's amazing. So in the same way, to get us to onto the path of Buddhism and away from our great suffering, the Buddha suggests the path of the Arahant, because he thinks people will be able to get their head around it, and they'll be able to think, yeah, that sounds like a good goal for me. That'll get rid of my suffering. Once we start going on the path, he will then reveal to us that the real goal was even better than the Arahant, was to become a Bodhisattva. And by that stage, we'll feel like, wow, you know what? I think I can do that. Okay, so that's explains why the Buddha seemed to teach that the Arahant path was better. What about this? How do they deal with the fact that we will have to wait a long time for even one person to become a Buddha? Like we've seen in Theravada, it says that Buddhism's got to die out before someone can become a Buddha. Even worse than that, Theravada actually says that actually gives the name of the next Buddha. The next Buddha, according to Theravada Buddhism, is called Maitreya. So that means that if we wanted to become a Buddha, we'd actually have to wait till Buddhism died out once, then Maitreya became a Buddha, then his form of Buddhism died out, and then we can become a Buddha after that. So it's almost impossible to become a Buddha. So how do they get over that problem? So within Mahayana Buddhism, teachings about how many Buddhas there can be at one time change. In fact, Mahayana scriptures make many major changes to how Buddhas are seen. Most notably, this is shown again in the Lotus Sutra. So the parable I had there was, sorry, I didn't mention this, was from the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the most important and famous Mahayana sutras. In this sutra, the Buddha teaches that when he appeared to die on earth, he did not really die. In fact, he reveals, his life on earth was merely an illusion. In reality, he was enlightened thousands of eons ago and continues to live not on earth, but in his Buddha land. So this is the idea in Mahayana Buddhism that actually the Buddha who came to earth is not the real Buddha. The real Buddha is some being that was enlightened ages ago. He lives in this other world called a Buddha land, and he sent down this illusion to go through the kind of charade of his life on earth in order to teach us. So this story reflects the view behind the Mahayana view of Buddhas. So first thing, when Buddhas reach enlightenment, they do not disappear from samsara, but continue to exist in their own realms known as Buddha lands, or sometimes pure lands. You might have heard that term. Secondly, they stay in these realms out of compassion, so that they can teach beings in samsara and lead them to nirvana. So this is unlike the Theravada view, because the Theravada view is that Buddhas, once they get to enlightenment, in fact all enlightened people, they get to enlightenment, once they die, they just disappear from samsara. It's actually said that it's impossible to say what happens to them. You can't say that they exist after they die, you can't say they don't exist after they die. But for all intents and purposes, they disappear. That's in Theravada. In Mahayana, no, Buddhas stay in samsara. They don't stay in samsara like we are, because we're trapped in samsara. They could leave, but they choose to stay in order to help other beings get to nirvana. And the idea is, so rather than there being one Buddha at a time, there are countless Buddhas, because all the Buddhas who have ever been enlightened stay, and they're still in their Buddha lands, each teaching that Buddha land. And so the idea is that they can be accessed either by people might meditate and therefore gain access, kind of in some special way to the Buddha land, or after you die, you could be reborn in the Buddha land. That's the basis of what's called Pure Land Buddhism. But in some way, that Buddha is still there, able to teach people. And because all the Buddhas stay around, that means that it's not true that you have to wait for one Buddha's teachings to completely die out from the universe before you become a Buddha. You can become a Buddha before that happens. So from this point of view, the idea emerges that becoming a Buddha is far superior than becoming an Arahant, because, firstly, even though it's harder to become a Buddha, it's a more compassionate goal, because the Arahant just disappears, whereas the Buddha stays in his Pure Land to teach people. Secondly, even though it's more difficult, it is not as difficult as suggested in non-Mahayana teachings, as there can be more than one Buddha at a time. Mahayana Buddhism does accept that becoming a Buddha is really tough, and the Bodhisattva path is a long one, it's likely to take many lifetimes, but it's not this idea that, well, it's just no point in trying to become a Bodhisattva because you'd have to wait, for billions of lifetimes. There can be more than one Buddha at one time. Thirdly, becoming an arahant becomes seen as selfish because arahants reach nirvana just for themselves and then disappear after samsara, whereas Buddhas do not disappear out of samsara, they stay here. So suddenly, becoming a Buddha looks much better than being an arahant. Okay, next thing then. We've seen why they want to become Buddhas. How do Mahayanas follow the Bodhisattva path? So one thing they do as part of their religious practices, followers of Mahayana Buddhism will make a Bodhisattva vow. This is a formal promise. So you say it in a formal way during a religious ceremony, saying you will reach Buddhahood, that's being a Buddha, Buddhahood, for the sake of others. It says for the sake of others, I should say for the sake of others. Here's an example of a Bodhisattva vow. So these are the sort of things people say during religious ceremonies, rituals, before they meditate, that kind of thing. People will say these promises. So here's one from the Avatamsaka Sutta, which is a Mahayana Sutra. It says, just as all the previous Sugatas, Sugata is another word for Buddhas, the Buddhas generated the mind of enlightenment and accomplished all the stages of the Bodhisattva training, so will I too, this is the key bit, for the sake of all beings, generate the mind of enlightenment and accomplish all the stages of the Bodhisattva training. So he's basically saying, for the sake of all beings, for other people's sake, not for my sake, for other people's sake, I will become a Buddha, or I will go through the Bodhisattva training to become a Buddha. So that's the idea. You make this promise. I promise to get enlightened, but not just for my sake, for the sake of all living beings, to help others. What else do they do? Well, they also will work towards the development of what's called the bodhicitta. A bodhicitta is a state of mind that wants to reach Buddhahood for the sake of all living beings. Mahayana Buddhism is well aware that when people start out on the path, they might have more selfish reasons for practicing Buddhism. They might just want to get to enlightenment for themselves. But what they say is, during your practices, you should do certain meditations and certain things to bring about this desire in your mind, to bring about this bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a feeling within your mind that you want to reach enlightenment, you want to become a Buddha, but not for your sake, for the sake of other people. It's only when, technically, it's when this state of mind is developed that someone is considered a bodhisattva. So you're not a bodhisattva, really, unless you've developed this part thing in your mind. If you've got the bodhicitta in your mind, if you really want to become a Buddha for the sake of others, then there you are on the bodhisattva path. Now then once you get on the path, they follow what are called the perfections. So the arahant, the path of the arahant is the eightfold path. Bodhisattvas, on the other hand, follow a list of perfections. So there are various lists of perfections, but most commonly used is a list of 6. So here they are. The 6 perfections are generosity, ethics, patience, energy, meditation, and wisdom. Now, there's a couple of things to say about this. One is that we've said that in the Pali Canon, the Buddha practices 10 perfections. And so there's a slight difference here. The usual list in Mahayana Buddhism is 6 perfections rather than the 10 that the Buddha practices in the Pali Canon. Although there are some differences. Some Mahayana sutras give 10, so there's various lists. In terms of what they actually are, the perfections, they are just qualities that you try to practice and practice and practice until you've made them perfect. In that way, they are quite similar to the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is similarly a list of 8 things that you practice and practice and practice until you're made perfect. And when they're made perfect, you have become an arahant. For the 6 perfections, you become a Buddha. And there are lots of similarities between these between the perfections and the Eightfold Path in practice. So you've got meditation in the perfections, and you've got concentration and mindfulness in the Eightfold Path. You've got wisdom in the perfections, and you've got right view in the Eightfold Path. You've got ethics in the perfections, you've got right action in the Eightfold Path. The one notable difference, I think, is that generosity is here. You could say that generosity is actively helping others, giving things to others, and that reflects the fact that Bodhisattva path is supposed to be about compassion, being a very compassionate person. If you look at the Eightfold Path, although there are things about how you should act, they're all about things you can't do. They're more put in the negative. They're like, don't be selfish, don't take things, don't attack people, don't do certain kinds of jobs, don't speak in certain kind of ways. There's not so much about actively doing things to help other people. So that is the one difference. Generosity being one of the 6 perfections is probably the most significant difference between the perfections and the 8 steps of the Eightfold Path. So that's what Mahayana Buddhists do. They make this bodhisattva vow. They try to develop this bodhicitta, and they practice the 6 perfections. Okay, so what do Theravada Buddhists say about all this? What do Theravada Buddhists say about Mahayana teachings? Well, Theravada Buddhists reject Mahayana ideas about bodhisattvas for a number of reasons. Number one, the most obvious, they do not believe in the Mahayana Sutras, which the new teachings are based on. They do not believe they are authentic teachings of the Buddha. Basically, most straightforwardly, they believe that these teachings are things that were made up by other people after the time when the Buddha died. So therefore, they've got no reason to believe the stuff in those scriptures. Because of this, because they don't accept those scriptures, they do not accept there can be many Buddhas at one time. This means they maintain that becoming a Buddha is an impractical goal for all people to follow. So in other words, they say, well, in the Pali Canon it says there can only be one Buddha at a time. Therefore, that's what they believe. And therefore they say, well, it's just impossible for everyone to become a bodhisattva. That's ridiculous. Thirdly, because they do not believe that Buddhas continue to live after death in their Pure Lands, they reject the complete superiority of Buddhas over Arahants. So they don't believe that Buddhas are like massively better than Arahants, because according to the Pali Canon, their view is both Buddhas and Arahants disappear from samsara after death. So there's nothing so much better about Buddhas compared to Arahants. Although, as Rupert Gethin says, they might think Buddhas, people who become Buddhas, slightly superior. In Mahayana, they're much better. But for Theravada Buddhists, they're not really that much different. They reject the idea that the Arahant is a selfish goal. Although the heroic path of the Bodhisattva is indeed full of compassion, Arahants are not lacking in compassion. So, yes, Bodhisattvas open up enlightenment to other people. But in Mahayana, Bodhisattvas are massively better than Arahants because they stay around to help people after they die. For Theravada Buddhists, Arahants are actually very compassionate. They're full of metta and loving kindness towards other people. They'll help to teach other people. While they're still alive in this life, they can teach other people and help them to reach nirvana. When they die, yes, they disappear from samsara, but that is true of Buddhas as well. So again, that difference between Buddhas and Bodhisattvas is not so intense when it comes to Theravada Buddhists. Okay, that's our second section done. That's the most important stuff. You've really got to understand why they have these different views on whether you should follow the Bodhisattva path, the Theravada and Mahayana Buddhists. Okay, advanced Bodhisattvas is our next section. Now, the thing about the word Bodhisattva is sometimes, when you come into contact with some forms of Buddhism, I've talked about Bodhisattva as being a goal, as being something that you want to become. But sometimes if you ask a Buddha about Bodhisattvas, they will point to you to images like the ones we've got in front of us. These are images that look a bit like the images of the Buddha in some ways. You've got a figure seated in meditation, but they also look a bit more magical. You know, these are kind of almost images of gods. In one case, you've got an image of one with, is it 4 arms there? Yeah, you've got one image of a bodhisattva with 4 arms. Now, these are what are called advanced bodhisattvas. These are 2 of the most famous advanced bodhisattvas. On the left, that's Avalokiteshvara, and on the right, that's Manjushri. Long, complicated names, especially the first one, but we will get used to them. Now, advanced bodhisattvas play an important part in Mahayana Buddhism. And the thing to bear in mind here, I suppose, is that being a bodhisattva is a goal for all Mahayana Buddhists, but there's also a belief in and an interaction with certain beings who are seen as already very advanced on the path, on the bodhisattva path. So, advanced bodhisattvas are beings who have progressed very far on the bodhisattva path. As a result, they possess abilities and powers that ordinary humans do not have. So, they are magical beings, almost godlike beings. They're not gods, but they're godlike if you take that to mean that they've got magical powers. They're, beyond normal humanity. So these bodhisattvas are still present in samsara and can be called on for help. The most important example is Avalokiteshvara. He is the bodhisattva of compassion, so he is dedicated to helping others. He is said to help anyone who is in trouble who calls on him for help. He is particularly known to help sailors in trouble at sea, people attacked by demons, people caught in floods and storms, people in prison or waiting for the death sentence, and women who are unable to have children. So In this sense, these bodhisattvas are bodhisattvas who you can pray to and request help from, and that they are thought to be able to answer your problems, to help you in your problems. So this sometimes confuses people. You've seen that, bodhisattva path in Mahayana is about something you should follow. You should try to be a bodhisattva. But then if you go into a bodhisattva temple, you might see people. Mahayana temple, you might see people praying to bodhisattvas, and they seem to be about these magical beings who can help you. The truth is about that is that bodhisattvas are both, because all that this is saying is that according to Mahayana, the bodhisattva path is quite a long one, and as you go up that path to becoming a bodhisattva, as you gradually practice those perfections, you gradually develop into a greater person. Now, eventually, you're going to end up in a Buddha who lives in his Pure Land, and those Buddhas are really, really advanced magical beings. They're far beyond a normal human being. As you get nearer to them, as you get to the top of that stage, then you've already advanced very far. So beings like Avalokiteshvara and Manjushri are very, very advanced on the bodhisattva path. In the human world, we may interact with people who are bodhisattvas. It might be that you meet bodhisattvas, people who are bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhist temples and stuff, but they will be in the lower stages. At the higher stages, people develop these massive superhuman abilities and can be prayed to for help. That doesn't mean, though, that Buddhists should just pray to bodhisattvas to help them and ignore becoming bodhisattvas themselves. In fact, they should do both. Mahayana Buddhists might pray for help from Avalokiteshvara, but they also would see themselves as being on the early stages of the same path that Avalokiteshvara is on, moving towards becoming a Buddha. Hope that makes sense. Okay, last question. Do bodhisattvas delay their own enlightenment? So I know I've noticed this many times in English language writings about bodhisattvas that this claim is made. So here I saw this on an online dictionary. It says, definition of bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism: a person who is able to reach nirvana but delays doing so through compassion for suffering beings. Now, in English language writing about bodhisattva, it is commonly stated that in Mahayana Buddhism, a bodhisattva is someone who delays their own enlightenment so they can help others. So this is the claim that they're saying bodhisattvas could get enlightened, but they decide not to, so they can help other people. Now, why do people think this? Well, it's complicated, but here's what I'd say. There are some references to bodhisattvas delaying their enlightenment in some Mahayana texts. So it's not like the idea is not found in Buddhism at all. There are some Mahayana texts, but not all, and there are huge numbers of Mahayana texts. There are other reasons, I think, why it's tempting for people looking at Buddhism from the outside to think that bodhisattvas delay their enlightenment. First of all, perhaps there could be some confusion with the Theravada belief, which says that if someone becomes a Buddha, then they will disappear from samsara after death. So having that idea in their mind makes some people think, well, okay, if bodhisattvas are really compassionate, and if Buddhas disappear when they die, then perhaps bodhisattvas don't become Buddhas so that they can stay in samsara and help people. Though, as you're probably aware, and we'll go to again, there's problems with that view. It also could be this: perhaps the existence of beings such as Avalokiteshvara, who seem to always be bodhisattvas and never reach Buddhahood, also causes confusion. I think that is a confusing thing. Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, those advanced bodhisattvas, they seem to permanently be bodhisattvas, but they're very advanced bodhisattvas. So it might raise this question for people looking on the outside: well, why haven't they become Buddhas yet? Are they deliberately delaying becoming Buddhas for that reason? However, those are the reasons that people might believe that bodhisattvas delay their enlightenment, but I think there are big problems with it. And Paul Williams, another very important scholar of Buddhism, in his book, Mahayana Buddhism, The Doctrinal Foundations, he challenges that idea. He says that, well, many Mahayana texts state that bodhisattvas become Buddhas in order to help other people. So they say, actually, the whole point of being a bodhisattva is to be a Buddha, so that you can help other people. Although there are some references in Mahayana Buddhism to bodhisattvas delaying their enlightenment, Williams really says that most scriptures suggest that no, bodhisattvas want to get enlightenment. That's how you help other people. Secondly, Mahayana ideas that Buddhas continue to live in Pure Lands means that there is no need to delay your enlightenment in order to help others. So it actually doesn't make any sense, the idea that a bodhisattva would have to delay their enlightenment, because they could do more to help other people when they were enlightened, so they have their Pure Land. Among the Tibetan Mahayana teachers that Paul Williams spoke to, all of them rejected this view. Tibet is one of the most influential countries in Mahayana Buddhism. Most of the biggest forms of Mahayana Buddhism practiced in the Western world come from Tibet. So they're very influential teachers, and all of the teachers he spoke to rejected the idea that bodhisattvas delay their enlightenment. No, they said bodhisattvas are beings that aim for full enlightenment as Buddhas as soon as they can, and they go into their Buddha lands and teach people from there. How do we explain the idea that Avalokiteshvara, these great advanced bodhisattvas, who people put so much emphasis on, never seem to become Buddhas? Well, that's hard to explain. It's hard to explain. But from an outside point of view, it might be that because Mahayana put so much emphasis on bodhisattvas, it kind of makes sense for them to have some people, some of their most kind of people they pray to most or respect the most, being beings on the bodhisattva path, because it means that they can be an example to people. You should be following in this way. Even if it logically doesn't really make sense that they stay on the bodhisattva path the whole time and never get to become Buddhas, it kind of makes sense in terms of motivation. It shows people, oh, you should be following this path as well, like this being Avalokiteshvara. So that's a complex thing at the end, but I do think it causes confusion because so many sources say this, that bodhisattvas delay their enlightenment. And even though, yes, Mahayana Buddhism is complicated, and therefore there are internal inconsistencies within Mahayana texts, so it's not always completely clear. It's much more the view, it's much more mainstream view, I would say, in Mahayana Buddhism, that a bodhisattva does not delay their enlightenment, as Paul Williams says. They, in fact, are aiming to become Buddhas because they can help people even more once they get to enlightenment, once they become Buddhas. Okay, that was a long video. I hope it made sense to you. This stuff is really important for Year 13 Buddhism, to know about the difference between Theravada and Mahayana views on the Bodhisattva is a vital thing, really. So yeah, make sure that you've gone through and understood the stuff in this video.